Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out the new Nvidia GeForce RTX 4080. I no longer need to specify that this is the 16GB model, as there is only one RTX 4080. The unlaunched 12GB version will no doubt still exist, but it'll be called something else like the RTX 4070 Ti, not the RTX 4080, so that in itself is a good thing. The bad news, of course, being that the 4080 still costs at least $1,200 US, and that's a massive 71% increase over the RTX 3080's MSRP, though of course Nvidia would probably rather you forgot that was everything and instead focus on the $1,200 3080 Ti, a product that I called pointless, an obvious money grab, so this is going to be interesting. Of course, the market has changed a lot since then, so it'll be interesting to see what the RTX 4080 has to offer. There is a lot to talk about with this review, plenty of benchmarks to check out, but I think first we will touch on the specifications and take a bit of a look at the Nvidia Founders Edition model before we get into all those blue bar graphs. And of course, I do have quite a few partner card models. So we've got the MSI Supreme X, the Asus Tough Gaming, and a PNY card with an awfully long name, but we'll get to all of that shortly. Let's first look at those specs. The RTX 4080 is based on the AD103 silicon, which measures 378.6 millimeters squared, and that's a massive 38% reduction compared to what we see with AD102 used by the 4090. Naturally, this means a huge 40% reduction in transistors, though the 4080 still packs 62% more transistors than the 3090 Ti. Given those figures, I imagine it will come as no surprise to you to learn that the 4080 has 41% fewer CUDA cores than the 4090. The memory bus width has been reduced by 33%, and there's 11% less L2 cache. As for core clocks, there is little difference between the 4090 and 4080. We're talking about 2505 MHz versus 2520 MHz for the boost clocks, so a slight advantage to the 4090. The 4080, though, has been awarded faster 22.4 gigabits per second GDDR6X memory, so a 7% increase there from the 4090. Though the smaller 256-bit wide memory bus means the overall memory bandwidth has been cut down by 29% from 1008 gigabytes per second to 717 gigabytes per second. Now, Nvidia claims a total graphics power rating of 320 watts for the RTX 4080, and that's the same rating given to the 3080. Though the maximum GPU temperature has been slightly downgraded from 93 degrees to 90 degrees. The minimum power supply requirement is 750 watts, and for testing I'll be using an 850 watt unit. Now, in terms of design, the Founders Edition 4080 is identical to that of the 4090, at least externally. The only difference that we can account for at this point in time is the weight. The 4080 FE model is 3% lighter. Obviously, there are some physical changes under the skin. I imagine power delivery has been a little bit cut down. The memory configuration has changed, there's less memory chips, and of course the GPU die is smaller. So it's very possible Nvidia made some changes to the cooling, but we don't have time to tear the card down for this review. Point is though, they physically look like the same product. And this means the RTX 4080 is still using the controversial 16-pin 12VH PWR power connector. Now, a lot has been said about this connector over the past month, but what the real story is, what's actually going on, well, in our opinion, it is still unknown at this point. So we're not going to feed into that story, that drama at this point in time. We believe there is a lot more investigation that needs to be done before drawing any real conclusions. What I will say is that a single PCIe 5.0 power connector can deliver up to 600 watts, and previously that would require 4 8-pin power connectors. However, you won't need a PCIe 5.0 compliant power supply, as RTX 4080s come with a 3x 8-pin to single 16-pin adapter, similar to the 3x 8-pin to 16-pin model supplied by the 3090 Ti's. And apart from the increase in cores, we also have the inclusion of 4th generation Tensor cores and 3rd generation RT cores. The GeForce 40 series also introduces DLSS 3, a feature that, at least for now, is exclusive to the GeForce 40 series. Now, since we last tested Nvidia's DLSS 3 technology, not a lot has changed, aside from the launch of a few more games supporting DLSS 3. Our investigation at the launch of the RTX 4090 is still the best place for a comprehensive breakdown of the tech, and it largely performs in the same manner on the RTX 4080. Nvidia are aware of the issues we brought up and are working on a few fixes for things such as the broken UI elements and transitions. They'll let us know when these updates have been rolled out, and of course we will then promptly revisit DLSS 3. As for our general thoughts on the technology, DLSS 3 does have some benefit, but it's of a more limited nature compared to DLSS 2. Gamers will benefit most from DLSS 3's frame generation technology when games are already being run at a good frame rate, somewhere around 100 FPS before DLSS 3 frame generation is enabled, with DLSS 3 then boosting the FPS to around 180 to 200 FPS. This provides better visual smoothness for those with high refresh rate displays and works quite well under these conditions that hides visual artifacts, and the latency problems we mentioned, they're minimized. It can work okay below this sort of frame rate, but it depends on the type of game and how sensitive you are to things like latency and artifacts. We wouldn't though recommend it for gaming below 120 FPS. Basically, it's a niche feature that adds to Nvidia's strong feature set, but it isn't something we'd specifically pay extra to access, at least not right now. So for this review, I won't be including any DLSS 3 benchmarks. As I said, Tim will revisit the technology once Nvidia addresses the issues uncovered in our initial investigation. As a side note though, I have heard from some reviewers who were only able to acquire a review sample from Nvidia if they promised to include DLSS 3 benchmarks in their review, which is fair enough, as DLSS 3 is a technology that requires investigation, but it really does need to be investigated properly, and the FPS benchmarks really do need to be accompanied by detailed image quality and latency analysis. Another big issue with DLSS 3 benchmarks is reporting frame generation as an FPS metric. For example, 120 FPS using DLSS 3 frame generation, it's not really 120 FPS. It's the smoothness of 120 FPS with the input of roughly half that frame rate, plus potentially a few graphical issues. And this is a serious issue for benchmark graphs, and I would suggest any reviewer benchmarking with frame generation enabled, they should report the numbers as 120 DLSS 3.0 FPS, as an example. Now, for testing all GPUs, we have done so at the official clock specifications, so no factory overclocking. The CPU used is the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D with 32GB of dual-rank dual-channel DDR4 3200CL14 memory on the MSI MPG X570S Carbon Max Wi-Fi motherboard. In total, I've tested 13 games at 1440p and 4K, so let's get into the data. First up, we have Watch Dogs Legion, and at 1440p we are CPU limited with these higher end GPUs. Still, the data is relevant for anyone with a 5800X 3D or a CPU that's slower, but for unrestrained GPU performance, let's move to 4K. Here we get a much better idea of what the RTX 4080 is actually capable of. 110 FPS on average meant it was 22% slower than the RTX 4090, but also 25% faster than the 6950 XT, 42% faster than the 3080 Ti, and 57% faster than the 3080. So some pretty impressive generational improvements there. Rainbow Six Extraction isn't as CPU limited at 1440p as what we saw in Watch Dogs Legion, and as a result, the 4080 was 40% faster than the 6950 XT and 30% faster than the 3090 Ti. That said, it was just 18% slower than the 4090, so let's see if that margin grows at 4K. As expected, it does, as here the 4080 was 20% slower than the 4090, though it did still manage an impressive 158 FPS at 4K, and that made it 45% faster than the 3080 Ti, 56% faster than the 3080, and 61% faster than the 6950 XT. Now for testing Far Cry 6, we don't use the built-in benchmark, rather we're showing actual in-game performance. Unsurprisingly, the data is very CPU limited at 1440p, and as a result, the 4080 was just 3% slower than the 4090 with 181 FPS on average. Moving to 4K shifts the primary performance limitation onto the GPU, and now the 4080 is seen trailing the 4090 by a 21% margin with 130 FPS on average. That also made it just 7% faster than the Radeon RX 6950 XT, which does very well in this title. But then it was 29% faster than the RTX 3080 Ti and 40% faster than the RTX 3080. Next up we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and at 1440p the RTX 4080 was good for 161 FPS, which saw it trail the 4090 by a 12% margin, while beating the 6950 XT by a 12% margin. But let's move on to 4K to see how those margins change. Interestingly, even at 4K, the 4080 was just 14% slower than the 4090 and just 15% faster than the 6950 XT. The Radeon GPU is helped along by excellent support for resizable bar, so overall, a bit of a disappointing result here for the new GeForce GPU. The RTX 4090 really impressed us previously in Hunt Showdown, And while the 4080 isn't as impressive, it's still well ahead of previous generation parts, trailing the 4090 by a 22% margin, but leading the 6950 XT by a 34% margin, the 3080 Ti by a 37% margin, and the 3080 by a massive 58% margin. Then we see that the 4K margins are much the same. Here the 4080 was 24% slower than the 4090 with 121 FPS on average, making it 29% faster than the 6950 XT and 44% faster than the 3080. As usual, we're seeing a clear pattern emerge here. This time, testing the Outer Worlds at 1440p saw the 4080 just 21% slower than the 4090, but 22% faster than the 3090 Ti, 27% faster than the 3080 Ti, 34% faster than the 6950 XT, and a massive 46% faster than the 3080. And the margins remain much the same at 4K, though here there are some odd changes. We see that the 4080 was good for 119 FPS, making it 25% slower than the 4090, but just 13% faster than the 3090 Ti, despite still beating the 3080 Ti by a 28% margin. So the 3090 Ti does seem to be doing a little bit better here than you'd probably expect. Hitman 3 is a very CPU intensive game, and admittedly the 5800X 3D, it isn't the fastest CPU here. In fact, not even close with the release of Zen 4 and Raptor Lake. So I will be updating all of our GPU data soon, though at this point I'll probably wait until early next year to see what gets announced at CES before investing weeks upon weeks to update all of our GPU data. All of that said, CPU limitations aren't an issue at the 4K resolution, and here we see that the 4080 is the expected 22% slower than the 4090 with 142 FPS on average. This did make it 26% faster than the 6950 XT and 69% faster than the RTX 3080. The 5800X 3D does perform really well in Horizon Zero Dawn, and yet despite that, we still run into a hard CPU bottleneck with the new GeForce 40 series, as both the 4080 and 4090 were limited to just over 210 FPS. Jumping up to 4K once again removes any CPU performance limitations and delivers the expected margins. As we've seen time and time again, the 4080 is a little over 20% slower than the 4090, and we're seeing a 24% margin in this example. Next up, we have F1 2021, and at 1440p, the 4080 was 16% slower than the 4090, with 206 FPS on average, and that meant it was 34% faster than the 3090 Ti and a massive 48% faster than the 6950 XT. Then at 4K, we see predictable margins, as now the 4080 is 25% slower than the 4090 and 52% faster than the 6950 XT. So really, it was just the 4090 that was running into system limitations at the lower 1440p resolution. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, we find that the 4080 was good for 128 FPS on average with the 5800X 3D pairing, which made it 12% slower than the 4090 and just 17% faster than the 6950 XT. Increase the resolution of 4K though, that does see fairly typical margins restored, and now the 4080 is 23% slower than the 4090, but 33% faster than the 3080 Ti and almost 50% faster than the original 3080. Dying Light 2 Stay Human isn't a very CPU demanding game, and as a result we're not CPU limited at 1440p, allowing the RTX 4080 to churn out 151 FPS on average, resulting in a typical 21% deficit to the 4090. That margin did grow slightly to 25% at 4K, and interestingly, the 4080 was just 11% faster than the 6950 XT due to an unusually strong result here for the Radeon GPU. The second last game tested is Halo Infinite, and here we are clearly running into a CPU bottleneck at 1440p, as the 4080 was just 6% slower than the 4090, but impressively, still 42% faster than the 3090 Ti and 51% faster than the 6950 XT. Oddly, at 4K, the 4080 is now only 32% faster than the 3090 Ti, which is still a large margin, but smaller than the 42% margin seen at 1440p. It's also now 23% slower than the 4090. The last game tested is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and at 1440p, the 4080 rendered an impressive 206 FPS, and that meant it was 13% slower than the 4090, but 35% faster than the 6950 XT. Then bumping up the resolution to 4K still saw an average of 116 FPS, though this did make the 4080 28% slower than the 4090, so that's one of the bigger margins we've seen. Disappointingly, it was also only 23% faster than the 3090 Ti and 33% faster than the 6950 XT. Okay, so here's a look at the 13 game average data. The RTX 4080 produced 189 FPS on average, making it 12% slower than the 4090 at 1440p in our testing. It was also only 24% faster than the 6950 XT and 25% faster than the 3090 Ti, while we're looking at a 38% boost over the 3080 Ti and 51% over the 3080. Then at 4K, where the CPU bottleneck is completely removed, the 4080 was on average 23% slower than the 4090, making the flagship Ada Lovelace GPU 30% faster. The 4080 was also 22% faster than the 3090 Ti, 31% faster than the 6950 XT, 37% faster than the 3080 Ti, and 52% faster than the 3080. Also, just because I know many of you will want to see the 1080p data, here's the 13-game average. Of course, we were almost always quite heavily CPU limited in this testing, and that's why the 4080 is just 16% faster than the 3090 Ti and only 7% slower than the 4090. Now, time for a look at ray tracing and upscaling performance, starting with F122. At 1440p, the 4080 and 4090 are limited to around 300 FPS with RTFX disabled, but enabling RT plus DLSS resulted in roughly the same level of performance with 181 FPS for the 4080 and 189 FPS for the 4090, and this made the 4080 just 12% faster than the 3090 Ti. Then with upscaling disabled, the 4080 was 32% slower than the 4090 and 22% faster than the 3090 Ti, while it crushed the 6950 XT by a massive 83% margin. Now, moving to 4K does help to remove the CPU bottleneck, and now the 4080 is 27% slower than the 4090 before the RT effects are even enabled. The margin actually grew to 36% with RT plus DLSS enabled, and then 38% with just RT enabled with no upscaling. When compared to the 3090 Ti, the 4080 was 19% faster, and then 100% faster than the 6950 XT. Yikes. Next up, we have Watch Dogs Legion, and here the 4080 and 4090 delivered similar performance under all three test conditions. The 3090 Ti was also able to match the 4080 with DLSS enabled, as this appears to be the limit of what the 5800X 3D can render with RT enabled. So moving to 4K does give us a much better picture of where the 4080 stands, and here it is 27% slower than the 4090 with RT plus DLSS enabled, and 26% faster than the 3090 Ti. It was also a massive 115% faster than the 6950 XT, which was using FSR. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is also quite CPU limited at 1440p. Of course, the performance overall is stellar, with frame rates up around 200 FPS without RT enabled, but it also doesn't show us how the 4080 truly stacks up, so let's move to 4K. Right, so at the 4K resolution, the 4080 is 22% slower than the 4090 with RT plus DLSS enabled, and 21% faster than the 3090 Ti. It was also a massive 81% faster than the 6950 XT, which was again using FSR. Moving on to the Dying Light 2 results, we see that at 1440p, the 4080 was 26% slower than the 4090 when comparing the RT plus DLSS results. This also made it 47% faster than the 3090 Ti, which is a huge margin, and we saw previously that the GeForce 40 series does very well in this title. It's also a similar story at 4K. Here the 4080 was 31% slower than the 4090, but 46% faster than the 3090 Ti, and a massive 100% faster than the 6950 XT, which was again using FSR. Finally, the last ray tracing / DLSS benchmark that I have for you looks at performance in Cyberpunk 2077. Here the 4080 rendered 102 FPS at 1440p with RT plus DLSS enabled, making it just 10% slower than the 4090 and 23% faster than the 3090 Ti. At 4K, those margins change, and now the 4080 is 27% slower than the 4090 when both are running RT effects with upscaling enabled. This also saw the 4080 defeat the 3090 Ti by a 26% margin and the 6950 XT by an incredible 115% margin. Okay, so what about total system power consumption? Well, the 4080 is remarkably good here, as we see in Dying Light 2, pushing total usage to 404 watts, which is similar to that of the 3070 Ti and 6800 XT, so very manageable indeed. It's also a 23% reduction in total system usage when compared to the 4090. Power usage did creep up a little bit in Doom Eternal, hitting 471 watts, and now the 4080 finds itself situated between the 3080 and 3090, but it did still reduce total system usage by 22% when compared to the 4090. Then finally, in Hitman 3, we find more of the same. Power usage is still lower than that of the 3090 and is really comparable to the 3080. So given the performance just seen, I'd say the RTX 4080 is very efficient, but let's go and lock the frame rate for an interesting look at power efficiency. Now with all 4 GPUs tested here locked to 90 FPS, we get to see just how power efficient the RTX 4080 is. The 4090 really did impress in this test previously, and we see that the smaller AD103 die is even more efficient, dropping power usage by around 6%. This means under these same operating conditions, the 4080 uses half as much power as the RTX 3090 Ti. Super impressive stuff. Now finally, it's time for our cost per frame analysis, and we'll start with MSRP pricing, just to get a feeling of where pricing over the life of each product should have been. Starting with the cost per frame based on the 1440p data, we see that the 4080 slots in between the 3070 Ti and 6900 XT, neither of which were particularly great value in their respective series. Then when compared to the 3080, price to performance has regressed by 13%, and at 27% when compared to the Radeon RX 6800 XT. Still, Nvidia would be quick to point out that when compared to the 3080 Ti, the 4080 is a substantial improvement in value, reducing the cost per frame here by 28%. The 4K MSRP data is a little more favourable, but even so, the 4080 is still 13% more costly per frame than the 3080, so in that sense, even when based on MSRP pricing, it's not great value. But when compared to the 4090, it is a slight improvement, though I suspect many of you who are entertaining spending $1,200 US on a graphics card would probably just opt to go the full hog with the 4090. The bigger issue with the 4080 in value can be seen when discussing the current GPU market, and in this graph using the 1440p data, it slips to one of the weakest options you can purchase right now, only roughly matching the terrible value RTX 3080 Ti. But given how CPU limited much of the 1440p results were, let's make our final value analysis based on the 4K data. So here we are, the cost per frame results based on the 4K data using current retail pricing. Here the 4080 is again slightly better value than the 4090, reducing the cost per frame by a mere 3%. Value-wise, the 4080 is also comparable to the 3080 Ti at its current asking price of $860, which frankly isn't great given that makes it 11% more costly per frame than the 3080, which is worse value than AMD's Radeon RX 6900 XT, and world's worse value than the 6800 XT. Of course, none of those GPUs are even remotely in the same league as the 4080 when it comes to performance, so it'll be very interesting to see what RDNA 3 can do here. Now let's take a look at the 3 partner models that I have on hand before checking out the operating behavior of each model, along with Nvidia's FE version. Starting with MSI's RTX 4080 Supreme X, this one's pretty simple if you've seen our RTX 4090 Supreme X review, as it's the exact same cooler. The 4080 version though does weigh just 60 grams less, and like the FE model, that difference can be attributed to the smaller GPU, fewer memory chips, cut down power delivery, and fewer components on the PCB in general. Still, at 2,360 grams, this thing is still very heavy and of course very massive. Given that the RTX 3090 Ti version of the Supreme X is smaller, the size and weight of the RTX 4080 is very much unnecessary. But it seems as though it was just easier for Nvidia's partners to mass produce these monstrosities and stick them on all current generation high-end graphics cards. So regardless of how you feel about these comically large graphics cards, it appears they're here to stay. Anyway, the Supreme X is an excellent quality model, it looks great, and as we're about to see, it works very well. Then we have the Asus RTX 4080 Tough Gaming, and this appears to be a carbon copy of the 4090 that we've already reviewed. I'm not saying that it's made of paper though, quite the opposite in fact. Like the 4090, this thing is wrapped in metal with very few plastic elements to speak of. However, while it does appear to be the same cooler, there are some noteworthy changes here which will reduce the manufacturing costs. Whereas the 4090 Tough Gaming tipped the scales at 2,320 grams, the 4080 version is 17% lighter at 1,920 grams. The bulk of that difference can be attributed to the cooler, which is 308 grams lighter at a total weight of 772 grams. Now, whereas the 4090 version made use of 8 nickel-plated copper heat pipes to contact with the large vapor chamber, the 4080 does away with the vapor chamber entirely, and although there are still 8 heat pipes, just 2 of them measure 8mm in diameter, with the rest of the 6mm variety. The 4090, on the other hand, packed 5 8mm heat pipes, and this allowed for a significantly larger contact patch with the base plate. Speaking of the base plate, the 4080 version only makes contact with the GPU, while an aluminium spreader contacts the memory chips, with the aid of a few thermal pads, of course. Then over on the PCB, there are fewer power delivery components, the much smaller GPU, and just 8 memory chips opposed to the dozen you'll find on the 4090. Then we have the P&Y RTX 4080, which wins the award for the absolute worst name. Are you ready for this one, guys? It's the P&Y RTX 4080 Accelerate, so XLR8, Gaming Verto Epic-X, so I think we're just going to call it the Vertu or Verto. Anyway, this is a fairly standard looking RTX 4080. It measures 71mm wide, so it will take up 4 slots. It's 332mm long, and it stands 136mm tall from the PCIe connector. All up, it weighs 1,860 grams, making it just 3% lighter than the RTX 4090 version. That said, there are some real design changes between the 4080 and 4090 versions, despite them looking very similar overall. The 4090 has a reinforcing structural bracket that runs the perimeter of the card, whereas the 4080 does away with that bracket entirely for a modified heatsink design, so an interesting difference there. Then there's the standard changes to the PCB, but since I haven't had a chance to review the 4090 model yet, I can't compare them all that closely just yet. The only issue I have with this model is the lack of a dual BIOS feature, which for me is a bit of a deal breaker, especially at this price point. Anyway, with that, I think we're going to take a look at thermals, operating clocks, and power. Okay, so here's a look at how Nvidia's Founders Edition operates after an hour of Hitman 3 at the 4K resolution using the maximum in-game quality settings. These temperatures were all recorded in a 21-degree room installed inside an ATX case with the doors closed. The GPU hotspot peaked at 78 degrees while the memory reached 74 degrees, and we saw an average core clock frequency of 2,760 MHz, a power draw of 300 watts, and a fan speed of 1,450 RPM. So decent results, but nothing amazing. The MSI Supreme X results, though, are remarkably similar, with the hotspot temperature also hitting 78 degrees, though the memory was slightly cooler at 72 degrees. We're also looking at a similar operating frequency at 2,745 MHz, with a power draw of 308 watts. The fans were spinning slower at 1200 RPM, but overall, a very similar result to Nvidia's FE model. Then we have the Asus TUF Gaming, and this card spun its fans a bit faster at 1550 RPM, which limited the peak hotspot temperature to 77 degrees, and the memory to 72 degrees, so basically the same result as the Supreme X and FE models. The average power draw was higher at 314 watts, and this allowed for a slightly higher sustained 2,775 MHz operating frequency. Then finally, we have the P&Y Verto, and as you guessed it, basically the same results. Here we have a hotspot temperature of 78 degrees, though the memory was considerably cooler at 62 degrees, so that's an impressive result. The average power draw was also fairly standard at 312 watts, and we have the typical 2,730 MHz core clock frequency. All of this was achieved at a 1300 RPM fan speed, so really the differentiating factors here are the physical card design, as in the appearance, and of course the price. Overall, I'm coming away from this review of Nvidia's new GeForce RTX 4080 with kind of mixed feelings. I guess from a performance standpoint, it is clearly a very impressive product, delivering 111 FPS on average at 4K across the 13 games we tested. So that's a 20 to 30% increase over previous generation flagships. And that's of course great and all, except for the fact that it's priced like a previous generation flagship at 20% more expensive than the 1600 XT and just 25% less than the already massively overpriced RTX 3090. And let's not even bother with the MSRP of the 3090 Ti. So while I absolutely love the performance and features of the RTX 4080, it's hard to get too excited when I know you guys have to stomach the $1,200 US asking price. Not only that, but we have the awkwardly named Radeon RX 7900 XTX, which will arrive next month at an MSRP of $1,000 US, and it should comfortably beat the RTX 4080, at least in terms of rasterization performance. There's still, of course, the issue of ray tracing, which is now a very important performance metric, and while FSR continues to improve, so too does DLSS, and it is still the superior upscaling technology. As a side note, if Nvidia were to only increase the 80 series MSRP by 29%, I know only, this would have seen the 4080 coming in at $900 US, so $200 more than the 3080. And although that's still a very big price hike, the 4080 would have been excellent value in today's market. And in fact, it would be the best value GeForce GPU on the market. matching the cost per frame of the $510 RX 6800. Sadly though, that is not to be, because Nvidia knows gamers will pay $1,200 US, so $1,200 US it is. Still, I think the point is, it's difficult to draw any real conclusions until we've seen what the 7900 XTX has to offer. Only then can we properly evaluate the value of the RTX 4080. So with that, I don't think there's much point dragging this review out any further. We now know exactly how the RTX 4080 performs, but at this point in time, you clearly shouldn't buy it, not if you care about value, getting the most bang for your buck, and all of that. And if you don't care about value, then the 4090 is probably the better choice anyway. Anyway, as I've said, given that the 4080's direct competitor is landing next month, there's little point in making any firm conclusions here. We'll just wait for the Radeon GPU review to really conclude what we think of the 4080. So with that, if you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like, subscribe for more content because there is plenty more content coming. And if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, get some really cool perks in return, then we have Floatplane Patreon. That'll get you access to monthly live streams with Tim and myself. We have one of those coming up shortly. Our behind the scenes content, our exclusive Discord server, great place to hang out. And Tim and myself are also active there. You can ping us, ask us questions, all that sort of stuff. And Q&As. I think I've said everything. But anyway, if you're not interested in that, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video, especially if you made it all the way to the end. Good stuff. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.